Thank you so much. Throughout this whole event, and indeed throughout my travels in Asia over the past 10 days, there has been a consistent demand, I think, for an authoritative American voice and for a sort of vision of how the world might look. I'm delighted to say that we are very lucky to have former Secretary of State, former Senator, former many things, Hillary Rodham Clinton with us. Thank you very much for being here. You are, in my experience, the first person to get a round of applause before you've even begun at this forum, so you're already ahead, and I should point out you have nobly come at a fairly late time in New York. And our idea was to do a tour d'horizon and begin in Asia and gradually head west towards America. As Secretary of State, you talked about economic statecraft and the importance of binding together national security with economic policy. And the message you get here repeatedly is that that message has gone. There was a time when America could come here and talk about trade policy. Now, when countries around here talk about trade, they tend to get pushed away. Do you think that idea of economic statecraft, particularly in Asia, is missing nowadays?
Well, John, thank you for that question, because I think it's a complicated one now. I think there's always room. In fact, there's a necessity for economic statecraft. But the definition of what we mean by that and how it's practiced certainly has changed in the last 10, 15 years since I first started using it. Because you're absolutely right. Post-COVID, post the challenges with supply chains, post one, now two wars that are challenging the global order. What do we mean by economic statecraft? Well, I think it does mean to continue through diplomacy in any way appropriate to find economic connections, networks, agreements that will enable countries to cooperate peacefully, to enhance their own economic positions, to find a way to satisfy the needs of their own citizens and to add to the global economic output. And it is very different today than it was. And I think whether we're talking about how we create economic statecraft around moving toward a clean energy system, or we look for ways to create more connectivity, both through actual trade and through the kind of cooperation that countries need to engage in. The definition is changing, but the necessity for us to practice economic statecraft remains.
Can I just push you on that a bit? If you visit any country here, Indonesia, even Singapore, Malaysia, all these places, they will all say the same thing. What they want with America is a trade deal. When they deal with China, they get a whole menu of economic possibilities. With America, they really want some kind of formal trade alliance. But that seems to have gone. Are you saddened by that?
Well, I am. I do think that it would be beneficial to the United States as well as to the countries you named and many others if we could define trade agreements for the age in which we find ourselves. That has to take into account, particularly in the United States, some of the concerns that citizens and businesses, workers, unions all have about whether trade agreements will really benefit them. We have to take into account with many other countries what really is the openness on the other side of the agreement. How willing will countries be to open their markets to American businesses? So I think we need a new era of realistic trade agreements that take into account where we are in the world today, that understand we have new stresses and pressures, and that can make a case, particularly in complicated societies like Indonesia, like the United States, that any agreement is going to benefit not just a very few large businesses, primarily multinational ones, but will get into medium-sized and small businesses, will benefit consumers and workers. We ought to be able to make that case. But historically, those have not been high priorities for many trade agreements. And one of the things that happened with the TPP is that it did not adequately explain what the benefits would be beyond a very, relatively small set of sectors and businesses within those sectors. So it's up to leaders, both government and business leaders, to make a better case. And I think we could do that, but it means adding that to the big agenda that many people are already facing. And so we have to make a special effort to try to begin once again to talk about trade agreements, but with an eye from the beginning to make the case for those trade agreements, not negotiate behind closed doors, then come out and then have people express their disappointments and opposition.
You talked about realism. We now have the meeting between President Xi and Joe Biden next week in San Francisco. There was a nice line from the Singaporean foreign minister here where he said, yes, the weather might get a bit better. We might have a deal on fentanyl, but the climate generally is getting worse between the US and China. Again, I think people would say it was better when you were around. Is there any sign of things getting better, or are they just going to get worse for a while and then maybe stabilize?
Well, I'm hoping that more comes out of the meeting. It certainly is a confidence-building opportunity. There hasn't been as much interaction until relatively recently between the Chinese and the United States governments. There has been a real chill coming from China about businesses, American businesses, other businesses inside China. And then there are, of course, political pressures against China within our own political system. So this meeting is a terrific opportunity to try to reset the table, so to speak, to try to create some opening. But it has to be followed up on with a lot more interactions. I was very pleased that Secretaries Yellen and Raimondo and others have been going to China in recent weeks. Nothing substitutes for the effort being made to have those kinds of meetings about strategic and economic concerns. I think a lot of what happens in the future really depends upon what Xi Jinping's goals are. Part of the reason it was somewhat more positive when I was there, and we had a very regular set of meetings, is because Hu Jintao was a Chinese leader who decided he would not stay for life. He would fulfill his term. He would follow the guidance of the Chinese Communist Party. There would be a transition, a new group of leaders, some holdovers, but, other new faces would be in power. And so there could be a constant renewing of both the Chinese government and, through that, the American relationship. Once Xi Jinping decided to stay in office for life, that creates a lot of challenges within their own system. And I think we're seeing some of that with the removal of top officials, some of the economic problems in the Chinese economy. But it also creates a kind of chilling effect in terms of relations. I mean, how do you deal with somebody who's not going to be held accountable? Their system of accountability was certainly different from ours, but it existed. And now it doesn't. And so part of what I hope will come out of this meeting is an attitude by President Xi that, he wants to get back to some kind of regular order, that he sees it in China's interest to really dig in with President Biden, develop a platform for discussions, for problem solving, look for ways to cooperate on whether it's, climate change or other matters that may be of mutual interest to us, really sending that signal. I think he will find a receptive partner with President Biden if that's available.
That's a very interesting perspective. I'm going to rush you slightly towards the Middle East, which I've seen you've been talking about this week, Israel and Hamas. I think you are in favor of a humanitarian pause or pauses, but you're against the ceasefire, which many people in this region are asking for. You know, the numbers of dead are rising rapidly, 10,000, according to Hamas, admittedly. But you still got like 89 dead at the UN, which is a gigantic number for the United Nations, the Red Crescent and so on. Can you perhaps explain why you don't want a ceasefire?
Well, I think there is a difference between a ceasefire, which would, in effect, freeze the situation in Hamas's favor. I negotiated a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in November of 2012. And at that point, both parties did not want to go any further. The breaching of a pre-existing ceasefire by Hamas with rockets being sent into Israel had not caused a lot of damage. There had not been the horrific massacre that we saw on October 7th. And there also had not been the development of the infrastructure of terror that Hamas has built in Gaza. I don't know any nation represented at the New Economy Forum faced with the kind of assault that Israel was faced with by Hamas that would not be, number one, defending itself, and number two, trying to prevent it from happening again. Because with every other ceasefire, it did happen again until finally we got to the breach of a ceasefire, which was in existence on October 7th with the terrible attack by Hamas. So a ceasefire, if it were possible, which frankly I don't think is possible, I don't think Israel is interested in a ceasefire at this point, but they are perhaps willing to have what we do call humanitarian pauses for the purpose of both getting aid in to try to assist the civilians in Gaza, but also getting the more than 240 hostages out. These hostages are not just Israeli. One of the biggest groups of hostages are workers from Thailand who are working on farms in Israel. So there is a global dimension to the hostages that a pause could perhaps inspire some willingness on the part of Hamas to let the hostages go. But a ceasefire that would freeze the situation at this point is not something that is going to, really undermine Hamas's capacity, especially with 200 miles of tunnels that they have constructed over the last decade, to launch yet another attack on Israel. And that would be intolerable. And I think it would be intolerable for, any nation represented at the forum.
There seem to be kind of two big theories going on about this war. One is that this is the end of the peace process. The other, which you champion, the other is that this is, if nothing else, this will prompt finally some move towards a two-state solution. Which side of that do you fit on?
Well, I actually try to fit on both. And I'll tell you, John, I think it's important to have some aspiration, some goal that we can look toward. Many of us, my husband particularly, worked very hard on trying to get a two-state solution. And it, frankly, in retrospect, is heartbreaking that Yasser Arafat walked away from the deal that Bill had brokered between Israel and the Palestinian Authority back in 2000. There could have been a Palestinian state on up to 97% of the land from the 1948 division that would have been in existence for 23 years now. So I think you have to create the environment in which there is a chance to revitalize the peace process and a potential for a two-state solution. Hamas is not interested in a two-state solution. They are dedicated to the destruction of Israel. That is in their charter. If you've been watching lots of different outlets over the last month, that is what the leaders of Hamas say. They want to destroy Israel. So Hamas is not a partner for any kind of peace or two-state solution, but the Palestinian Authority might one time again be. New leadership in Gaza might again be. So you have to get to a point where that's possible.
Very quickly, do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu is a partner for a two-state solution?
I don't think there's any evidence of that. I think the Israeli people will have to decide about his leadership. I think there will be investigations about what led up to and what happened on October the 7th. But I think there needs to be new leadership of the Israelis and the Palestinians in order to have any chance at some kind of peace deal, especially a two-state solution.
Can I jump a little bit more optimistically towards Europe? You've had a series of recent results in Europe. You've had in Greece, in Poland. You've had people I suspect you would support winning. In Britain, you're heading towards election, the place which went through Brexit, Boris and Liz Truss. We now have two rather boring men, but they are nevertheless within the general field of what people would regard as compatible, competitive, normal politics. Do you think there is a sign of politics changing at all?
I certainly hope so. I want to make boring popular again. You know, I want to get back to people who get up every day and do the job. Don't think that they are entertainers and performers who need to be outrageous and get a lot of attention on social media. So
I wonder who you're referring to.
I'm for the boring, public servants and government leaders right now.
Bring back boring. On that subject, in your own country, there has been something of a split from the point of view of the Democrats. You have had the big success in terms of some of the state elections this week, with abortion particularly seeming to help the Democratic side, but you've got some pretty bad polls from the battleground states. I think you've come out already saying that Joe Biden is still the answer, but do you want to explain that to people here?
Well, first of all, I'm not a fan of polling a year out from an election. I think to go back to what we were just talking about, there's a tendency among voters, and particularly I would say among Democratic voters in the United States, to always be looking for, the next cool thing. Who's the really exciting candidate that we're going to have? And so there's a lot of churn about what we really are going to look for and end up with. But I believe Joe Biden will be the nominee. I believe he will be reelected. I believe that both on the merits of his record, which is quite remarkable given the difficult political environment in our country, but also because of the alternative. It still looks likely that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. I know that's hard for people to believe with everything going on, but that seems to be the likely outcome. And so there very well could be a rematch. And I think in that kind of a rematch, as we've seen in the elections just yesterday, people are kind of moving away from the drama, from, all of the chaos. They want, to just have regular order again. And they voted yesterday for people who are standing up for issues that are popular, like the right to have women make their own reproductive decisions, for example. But you had a governor in Kentucky, a deeply red state, a Democratic governor, get reelected. He made abortion a central issue. He made red flag laws so that people who are dangerous don't get guns, which seems like a very sensible position. He made those really central to his campaign, and he won a very big victory. So I think that Joe Biden will be the nominee. I think Trump right now will be the nominee, and I think Biden will be reelected.
Vote Democrats and dare to be dull.
That's right. That's right. It's the new cool thing, John. Just get out there and show your dullness, but get the job done. Be productive and dull.
There's one area, just one serious. I'll ask you one serious one, then a slightly more amusing one. But on the serious side, you look at things like Ukraine at the moment. There is definitely a strategy among America's enemies. You could see Putin waiting, perhaps for Trump, trying to dig in and wait, but also, I think also counting on Congress, where you feel that Congress feels overextended. It's got the border, it's got what's happening in Israel. Do you worry about America feeling as if it's overextended and unable to carry out the kind of global policies that you believed in?
Well, up until now, the Biden administration has done quite a remarkable job. I mean, they put together a coalition to support Ukraine, which I think many people would have thought unlikely when Biden took office. So I do think the legislative agenda that Biden got passed is also another very strong indicator of being able to get things done. I do agree with you that it is going to be challenging in the Congress to get more funding for Ukraine, to provide the funding Israel needs, to provide the kind of support that is required to keep our alliances strong around the world. But at the end of the day, I think the president will get that. And I also think there's an opportunity for the president because the Republicans in the Senate have said, you know, we're on board with all of this, but we want to make some changes at the border. I think that, you know, the Democrats should negotiate to see what kinds of changes would be palatable for the Democrats in order to secure the border, in order to make it clear that, you know, Democrats want a secure border and a humane system for people who are trying to enter the United States, but we want it to be orderly. So I think there's going to be a lot of tough negotiation at the end. I think the president will get what he needs.
Just one quick thing on Ukraine, because you mentioned it. Do you think there is any hope of persuading China to come in and help on that? So far, China has had an effect on Vladimir Putin in terms of saying don't use nuclear weapons or saying those are off the ground. Is there any room of persuading them to kind of push him into something closer to a ceasefire there as well?
I don't know the answer to that, John. I think China has played an important role in trying to send a message to Putin not to stretch, particularly when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons. But I think China's also been surprised at how difficult it has been for the Russian military to achieve their military objectives. I think that's caused China to do some serious evaluation internally about their own military. I think that's part of what we may be seeing with some of the changes in military leadership, with the assessment that, you know, everybody thought the Russian military was very effective. It turned out not to be. What are the lessons we can learn? I think the more important, decision right now is for the United States, Europe, and other like-minded countries to continue supporting Ukraine, support them with the military equipment they need in order to, hold the line and push back as much as they can. You know, the more equipment that we can provide Ukraine, the more they can defend themselves and try to take back the territory that has been seized since 2022. That should be our objective. That's what we should be focused on. But you said something earlier, which I think is absolutely right. I think Putin is waiting to see whether Trump can come back. I think, the fact that Trump said when he was president before that he would pull the United States out of NATO is like the fulfillment of Putin's dreams. And so if he can figure out how to hold this in a frozen conflict position, not lose any more ground to the Ukrainians, and wait to see whether there's some opportunity, in fact, probably try to help Trump in the election as he has before, then I think, there may be, a kind of stalemate for a while, and the West cannot be discouraged by that. We have to keep, supporting the Ukrainians to push as far as they can push.
One very last thing. You mentioned the Republicans. On the Republican side, you will have noticed how much traction Nikki Haley has been getting as a woman who was the American ambassador to the UN. Do you think that if Biden were to stumble, there might be room for another woman with slightly more foreign policy experience?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I hope Biden doesn't stumble. I hope that he goes all the way to, the finish line, because I think he's earned it. He deserves it. And, honestly, the only real argument or complaint is that he's old. And you know what? I think everybody who's his age would be very happy if they were as productive as he is and has gotten as much done as he has and traveled the schedule he's traveled. So, I'm going to continue to support him, and I think he's our best candidate for 2024.
That was an immaculate answer on which to finish. We are very grateful for you staying up and doing. Madam Secretary, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.